Well, good evening everybody, and a very warm welcome to the new club and to this meeting of the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club this evening. Very warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for coming along on a particularly, I think, cold and dreary evening. It certainly got me thinking about what Scott would be doing on a similar evening like this, maybe drawing the curtains, having a look into a good book, maybe one of his own, or perhaps he might be venturing out, much like we are this evening, for a meeting of, I don't know, a club, perhaps the Speculative Society, she says, with a perfect link to the topic of our talk this evening. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, our very own David McClay. So David is formerly a trustee at Abbotsford and formerly the senior curator of manuscripts at the National Library of Scotland. He's currently, of course, the Honorary Secretary of the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club, and he's also currently Philanthropy Manager for Library and University Collections at the University of Edinburgh, and an extraordinary member of the Speculative Society. And so, welcome, David. Thank you very much for talking to us this evening, and very much looking forward to hearing your talk.
Well, good evening, one and all. It's lovely to see you all here. So Enlightenment Edinburgh abounded with clubs and societies, many of course with Scot associations. Most of these bodies were fairly short-lived, but some hardy ones have survived. Whilst all had a social, if not a convivial character, they also tended to have serious purpose, focusing on philosophical, political and literary inquiry, and promoting improvements in culture, science, justice, agriculture and industry. Scott's time at university gave him the first opportunity to be sociable and clubbable. Although attending some Edinburgh University classes from the age of 12, he attended fully in his late teens, between 1789 and 92, after which he was called to the bar. He was 19 in late 1790 when he joined the Speculative Society, staying active over 5 sessions until late 1795. During Scott's formative educational and early professional years, he was ever industrious, successfully joining a number of societies, the Speculative Society being the most significant. He immediately became a central figure, the key office bearer, serving on nearly every committee and hardly ever missing a meeting. A winter society, they met one evening a week from October to March. It was a society founded for the improvement of literary composition and public speaking through the delivery of essays, participation in debates, and the running of the society's affairs. Ordinary membership being limited to a maximum of 30, with those who had undertaken all duties and responsibilities over a period of not less than 3 years being allowed to petition for extraordinary membership and the associated privileges. Such was Scott's remarkable contributions to the running of the society. He was given the rare distinction of elevation to honorary membership in 1794 without first having to become an extraordinary member. Scott maintained his association with the society until the end of his life, and he continues to be venerated in the society to this day. This lecture will examine Scott's roles and activity in the society and highlight some of the key relics which celebrate him. Whilst the Speculative Society was not one of the earliest, it has proven to be one of the most enduring of the enlightened societies. It was founded by university students, led by future publisher William Creech, and encouraged but independent from the university professors and authorities. It is effectively closed to strangers when in session, the exception being a unique relationship with one foreign society and a handful of exceptional occasions, some of these as you'll mention later. This closed nature and their independence naturally gave rise, in some conspiratorial minds, to an image of a secret, even a nefarious society. However, even as a private society, the preferred word, they have regularly published their history, including lists of members in 1845, 1905, 1968, and with the current history currently working its way through the press. Scott, of course, features notably in each volume. The Spec was instituted on the 17th of November 1764, with the first meeting held on the 23rd. So whilst we don't exactly fall on those foundational anniversaries, perhaps I can encourage you at the reception following this, or for those of you visiting halls on Saturday, to raise a glass to this venerable institution's 260th year. Initially, like most similar societies, it met in taverns. However, they soon established a dedicated hall. Their first hall was adapted from an older building, afterwards demolished to make way for the development of Old College. In compensation, the Independent Society was given space in Robert Adams' masterpiece building, with rooms known as halls designed by William Henry Playfair. They remained largely unchanged since they were opened in 1819, especially the debating hall still lit by candle and coal alone. Scott knew the new halls, but his period of active membership was in the original. This they obtained in 1769, having petitioned the town council, as patrons of the university, for permission. The building cost the society £164 and was a reasonable 20 feet long by 23 feet wide, in what is now the southwest corner of Old College. The Spec showed their appreciation to Principal William Robertson by following a special vote and inviting him as a stranger to attend the debate in halls. It's not recorded whether he enjoyed it or not, I'm sure he did. A lobby was added in 1775 at the cost of £50. And there are engraved copies of John Sim's drawings recording these buildings, which hang in our lobby, which you'll see on Saturday. For a society of young men, these were not inconsiderable sums to expend, nor was the 200 guineas the Spec subscribed in 1789 to the building of Old College, which of course was then known as the New College. Scott's enthusiasm for joining literary and debating societies is understandable, given his social nature and his enthusiasm for learning and improvement. He founded or joined several, including the Literary Society and Club, but the most significant and long-lasting was the Spec. Scott petitioned to join the society on the 14th of December 1790. This was secretly balloted upon. He was formally admitted the following week, being able to first attend halls on Tuesday the 4th of January 1791. For admission to the Spec, your petition must be endorsed by 2 current members, Scots being Alexander Irving, afterwards Lord Newton, and Thomas Douglas, afterwards the 5th Earl of Selkirk. Whilst Douglas was a close friend, Irving seems to be less connected to him, perhaps endorsing his application as he was Society President that night. Further connections between Scott and the Spec can be easily found with Scott's professors and friends. 4 academics in particular were important to Scott and were key Spec members. Moral philosophy Professor Dugald Stewart, who encouraged many of his most brilliant students towards membership. Founding member of the Spec John Bruce, and afterwards a popular philosopher. Also Alexander Fraser Tytler, afterwards Lord Woodhouse-Lee, who taught universal history, and Baron David Hume, whose influential Scots law classes Scott attended. Many of Scott's friends were also Spec members, especially in the year of his petition and admission. This was just a quick check that I made. Others would perhaps be able to make more connections, but I think it's quite telling, particularly in the year of 1790, exactly how many people were clustered around Scott's admission. So we have number 256, 261, 265, 266, 267, and then Scott appears. There's a slight aberration with George Abercrombie there, and he was actually petitioned and admitted before Scott was, couldn't actually come into halls until after Scott, so technically before him. There are numerous friends, of course, who were not Spec members, with close friends John Irving and William Clark being notable absences. However, for such an exclusive society, the proportion of those ordinary, extraordinary and ordinary members known to Scott is high, and can reasonably have been expected to have made him aware of the Spec and encouraged his membership. In joining Scott's signed roll, as members still do with a quill pen, he was number 269. We are now in the 248th session, missing some due to world wars and the recent pandemic, and have now surpassed over 2,200 members. It is immemorial custom that Scott's death mask is brought to sit on the Secretary's desk on nights in which new members are introduced. I will return to this and other relics later in the talk. When Scott joined, Alexander Irving and Gilbert Hutchison had been joint librarians for several years. They both immediately resigned in favour of Scott. The library had been founded in 1784 at the encouragement of Lord Dare, spending an initial £200 on books and adding an interesting multi-volume collection of rare and historic pamphlets as well as contemporary publications. The first librarian in 1785 had been John Lockhart, father of Scott's future son-in-law John Gibson Lockhart, who was noted for his piety and astronomical interests, and described by Scott as that best and dullest of all possible doctors. Lockhart was succeeded by George Baird, who, thanks to his religious devoutness and brilliance in Oriental languages, as well as useful family connections, succeeded in 1793 at the youthful age of 33 Robertson as principal of Edinburgh University. His remarkable 47-year tenure as principal of the university being beneficial to the spec and university relations. This is the library, not quite today, but recently. Appointment as librarian at this time then would seem to be a notable one. However, as most office bearers may attest, it may simply have been a lack of enthusiasm elsewhere to take on the responsibilities. Either way, it was a perfect appointment. As librarian, Scott had to supervise the borrowing of books and their return, to report once a year to the Committee on the State of the Library, and to carry out instructions as to new acquisitions. It would seem that each of the previous joint librarians had expected the other one to do the work. Scott found books missing and difficult to recover, and a large balance of unpaid fines. Being methodical by nature, and with his intrinsic respect for books and libraries, Scott soon brought the library into good order. To the burden of librarianship, Scott was afterwards, on the 16th of November 1791, also appointed as Secretary and also appointed to the now defunct office of Treasurer, surely a recognition of his demonstrative abilities as librarian. These posts needed someone of Scott's abilities and dedication. The Society's finances had got into a tangle from which Scott helped to extricate them. As Secretary, he kept the minutes, with occasional spelling eccentricities. These had been loaned with other Scott items to anniversary exhibitions in Edinburgh in the past, 1871 and 1932 notably. As Secretary, Scott had a few exceptional issues to deal with, which I shall briefly mention. A Frenchman, Monsieur Terray, had been admitted to the Society shortly after Scott, being a non-residing member and having returned to France at the end of the year. A couple of years later, following the execution of Louis XVI, Terray faced expulsion from France and critically had to prove his former residence in Edinburgh, which following a committee that included Scott and a suitable Latin certificate subscribed and sealed by Scott in what he described the most ample manner, this proved satisfactory and Terray was allowed to stay in France. That the Society at this time had credibility in such a sensitive and critical matter is notable, as is Scott's competent management of this brief affair. Another incident, in 1793, Scott recruited a temporary replacement to the Society's officer and doorkeeper, appointing Mungo Watson, a professional concierge, beadle of Lady Yester's Church, the hall keeper of the Society in Scotland for the propagation of Christian knowledge, and one of the doorkeepers during the sittings of the General Assembly. Apparently a very lucrative side gig. So he was such a well-known figure as to be caricatured by John Kay. It turned out to be a shrewd and successful appointment. It must have needed some of Scott's negotiation skills to get such an in-demand figure. Scott, of course, would go on to make a number of astute household appointments later in life, and this must have been the first similar one he had responsibility for, and quite possibly was a very useful learning experience. A final example of his extraordinary secretarial tasks, we must turn to another society. The Speculative Society has long been associated with the Historical Society of Trinity College Dublin. It grew out of a slightly earlier society founded by Edmund Burke in the same year as the Spec, 1764, but not formally constituted until 1770. They are officially the oldest student society and debating society recognised by the Book of Records, Guinness Book of Records. What of the Spec, you surely ask? Well, whilst we're well populated by students and former students, the Spec is not limited to students and therefore is not a pure student debating society. So we're quite happy to pass the Guinness crown across to Dublin. The Dublin Historical Society and the Spec entered into fraternal reciprocity in 1783, with a considerable interchange for 23 years thereafter, but with more coming from Dublin to Edinburgh than going the other way. The association continues to this day, and they are still the only external society members allowed to present themselves in halls during debates. In 1795, Scott welcomed two Dublin visitors, Dr. Toomey and a Mr. McGrath, for a night in session in halls. They presented a letter and pamphlet and asked for the Spec's support in their dispute with college authorities, which after a large committee process sent formal letters of support drawn up by Scott. These are published in one of our histories. Again, this is a good indication that the Spec, far from being considered a minor or student society, had independence, authority and competence. Scott also helped keep the minutes and records with scrupulous care, albeit with sometimes arbitrary spelling. As Treasury had to collect all the sums due to the Society by way of entry money, subscriptions and fines, to pay out wages, to pay for coal, candles, new books, newspaper advertisements and to report annually on the Society's finances. Scott's predecessor, a Mr. Weir's negligence was apparent. A failure to correct arrears, uncertainty over the Society's bills, easy-going but not dishonest confounding of his own and the Society's monies. And it was probably Scott's experience as Secretary-Treasurer rather than his training in accounts in his father's office which initiated him into the mysteries of protested bills and promissory notes with which his own affairs later would be far too familiar. The burden of holding all three office-bearer positions meant, however, that Scott was never one of the Society's 5 presidents. 5 presidents is considered too burdensome for one person to carry responsibility alone. However, Scott did preside twice on special occasions. George Baird was given a Spec dinner and an honorary membership on the 10th of December 1793 to celebrate his appointment as principal, with Scott chairing the second part of the evening's long proceedings. A role he also took at the Spec's Jubilee celebration dinner on 17th of December 1814, held at Fortune's Toutine Tavern here on Princes Street. In completing his duties to the Society at a time when they easily could have folded, Scott clearly made the most important contribution. We must now turn to the responsibility of all members, the delivery of essays and the involvement in debates. Scott's antiquarian interest dominated his essay subjects: the feudal system, the poems of Ossian and Scandinavian mythology. Unfortunately, these essays do not survive, as today's practice of archiving was not then active. Scott was unusually not called back as an extraordinary or ordinary member to give an introductory or valedictory address at the start or the end of a session. So these are his 4 ordinary essays to briefly consider. Scott's first Spec essay had evolved from an earlier submission to the Literary Society on the feudal system entitled "On the Manners and Customs of the Northern Nations." This was subsequently given in as classwork in Dougal Stewart's class, to which he reportedly said, The author of this paper shows much knowledge of his subject and a great taste for his researches. Scott became a frequent visitor to Stuart's house and they remained friends until his death. The essay would be recycled again as On the Origin of the Feudal System and read to the Society on 26 November 1791. Feudalism, of course, continued to be an enduring interest for Scott. According to Lockhart, parts of this essay may particularly survive in his Encyclopaedia Britannica Essays on Chivalry and Romance, published in 1824, and in the fourth series of Tales of a Grandfather. Scott's example of recycling older work for your first essay in halls is not unknown to many new members in the Spec today, so he established a good tradition. Scott's second essay was delivered on the 14th of January 1792 on the authenticity of the poems of Ossian. A revised or sequel version of this essay was also provided his fourth and final essay on this subject on the 3rd of April 1793. The submission of the same topic twice is indicative, of course, of Scott's own interest in it, but also the shared interest of Spec members. Scott, in his words, had devoured rather than perused Ossian as a boy. The authenticity of Ossian's poems, collected and published by James Macpherson, was a literary controversy of the 1760s, but was still a lively topic a generation and more after. In writing to Anna Seward, he described it as the great national question of Ossian and the great dispute. He also wrote, "I should be no Scottish man if I had not very attentively considered it at some point of my studies." This period clearly included his Spec years. To Anna, he explained, "After making every allowance for the disadvantages of a literal translation and the possible debasement with which those now collected may have suffered in the great and violent change which the Highlands have undergone since the researches of Macpherson, I am compelled to admit that incalculably the greater part of the English Ossian must be ascribed to Macpherson himself, and the whole introductions, notes, etc., is an absolute tissue of forgeries." Scott's essays and other writings do, however, at least offer some qualified acceptance of what Macpherson offered. Scott afterwards went into print on the Ossian controversy. Fellow advocate and Spec member Malcolm Lane published poems of Ossian with notes and illustrations in 1805, a critical account which cast doubt on their authenticity. The following year was also published a more hopeful but largely damning report of the Committee of the Highland Society of Scotland appointed to inquire into the nature and authenticity of the poems of Ossian. Doesn't quite make an acronym, does it? Scott reviewed both in the Edinburgh Review, tempering Lane's more than scepticism with a little of the Highland Society's will to believe. Thereafter, Ossian makes scant appearances in Scott's work. In the Antiquary, of course, we have a discussion of Ossian brought forward between Oldbuck and his nephew Hector MacIntyre. However, no references appear in the Highland settings of Waverley, Rob Roy, or his verse romances. Scott's third essay on Scandinavian mythology and ballads was read on the 11th of December 1792, the very night that Francis Jeffrey, afterwards Lord Jeffrey, was first admitted into halls. He was so impressed that he called on Scott the following day at his parents' home at 25 George Square, just a short walk from the Spec halls. He was taken down into Scott's basement then, and Geoffrey found Scott surrounded by books and objects of antiquarian interest. They went off to supper together and a friendship was fostered. They became key allies in stabilising and reforming the Spec and enjoyed a deepening friendship. Of the essay itself, perhaps some preparatory notes for this may survive at Abbotsford. To debates. No, I was expecting. Scott spoke in 21 debates, opening in 2, which is average for an active member. Whilst not noted as a great orator, his contributions were welcomed as good-humoured and sensible, with a reserve of information and quotations to draw upon, which, according to John Gibson Lockhart, made him more a favourite as a speaker than some whose powers of rhetoric were far above his. Subjects for debate included historical, moral, legal, financial, metaphysical and aesthetic matters. Subjects were often modified and repeated, especially capital punishment, established religion and divorce by mutual consent were regular topics. On 1st of March 1791, Scott opened on "Was the putting of Charles I to death justifiable?", which was carried 10-3. However, when the debate was rerun under "Was the death of King Charles I justifiable?" on 18th of December 1792, it was not carried 8-1. Might we suggest the strength of Scott's contribution in the first debate and opening? Perhaps, but really this is no more than speculation. George Allen asserts in the Life of Sir Walter Scott that in debates Scott had argued that a national debt can promote a country's prosperity, that mercy is incompatible with justice, and against the expediency of divorce by mutual consent. However, he cites no evidence to support these assertions, and the minutes do not detail which side of a debate, who were appointed or who chose to speak. Whilst the genuine opinions and abilities of Scott in the debate at this time may be difficult to ascertain, we might reasonably suggest that participation in debates was an improving opportunity for Scott. The issue of debating political subjects became increasingly controversial, and Scott took a lead in settling the matter. In a period of political turmoil at home and abroad, young men meeting in private to discuss who knew what was increasingly seen as suspicious and potentially dangerous. In December 1794, Scott, principally supported by Geoffrey, looked to address declining membership. The 8 sessions, including Scott's years between 1789 and 1796, only 43 new members were added to the roll, about 5 or half of the ideal annually. The situation was so dire that some meetings were abandoned as they were not quorate. One of the reasons considered at the time for fragile attendance numbers, Scott and Geoffrey believed, was the sensitivity of private political discussions. A committee was named, including the principal, all professors who were members of the society, the founder William Creech, senior members and Scott himself. Their committee report asserted that the society at the present juncture should be cautious in admitting as subjects of discussion or debate the political topics of the day. This was agreed to by the whole society, however practically banning political discussions is impossible, and politics continued to weave its way into essays and debate. The political restrictions were only officially repealed in January 1826, long after it had been recognised as an unenforceable ban. One of the most important offshoots of the Spec was the foundation of the Edinburgh Review, founded by Geoffrey along with Sidney Smith and fellow Spec members Francis Horner and Henry Brougham. Now he appears. In 1802, as the first periodical to be editorially independent. Scott also played a key early role in contributing early articles, until his Tory politics and differences on style led him to split, one of the consequences of which was his vital help to John Murray II to set up a rival London-based quarterly review, to which Lockhart, his son-in-law, would eventually become the long-serving and influential editor. Despite Scott's differences in political opinion with the Whigs' great rising star Francis Horner, he also, in exemplar Spec fashion, always respected the man and even gave the toast to him in their 1814 Jubilee dinner. He died a few years later, and a general meeting of the Spec was held, with many senior members attending and others, including Scott, expressing their support that a suitable memorial should be made. This ended up being a copy of the 1812 3/4 length Raeburn portrait, which was placed in the recently opened halls in 1820, with a tribute plaque written by Geoffrey, first the ornament of this institution and then of his country. Scott and Horner now flanked the essayist podium, and to me it seems like a fitting tribute that the two men of different politics, but the shared enlightened and gentleman qualities, can share the flanks. Did Scott then fulfil the central objectives of the society to improve. Certainly in terms of building his reputation as a friendly, trustworthy gentleman who could deal efficiently with matters of business, he succeeded. He also reinforced and built his social network. In terms of literary composition and public speaking, his writing abilities surely benefited from his own compositions, perhaps more so from hearing and commenting on so many often brilliant young men's essays. His often underrated role as a wide-ranging periodical critic, to me, were incubated in halls. Whilst debating may have less natural enthusiasm for him, his confidence in public speaking seems to have improved. Important also were his experiences in committee work, occasionally dealing with senior university and spec members, as well as being the key office bearer who would have, on every session night, had to keep order and respond to 17 successive different presidents that he served under. All of this would have been perfect training for his immediate and subsequent legal career. It was a pattern to be followed by men for 2 centuries, joining the spec and then going on to the law. This is another key contemporary print showing the young men at the bar who no longer decided to wear the old-fashioned wigs. You can see Scott in the second row on the far left there. Highlighted in red are the ones who were fellow spec members, not quite 5 of the 12. Scott's own reflection on his time in societies, including the spec, is best found in his 1808 memoir of his early years, written by himself. He recalled that it is well known that in Edinburgh, one great spur to emulation amongst youthful students is that those associations called literary societies formed only for the purpose of debate but of composition. He goes on to reflect on the challenges of thriving in the mixture of robust personalities, sometimes satirical, sometimes brilliant, occasionally ill-tempered, but more often friendly. Despite an absence from Edinburgh and some friends joining the likes of the Literary Society, the spec clearly brought out the best in young Scott. He attributed this himself to a ready wit, a good deal of enthusiasm, a perception that soon ripened into tact and observation of character, rendered me an acceptable companion to many young men whose acquisitions in philosophy and science were infinitely superior to anything I could boast. Now, the following quote is quite a long one, but I think worthwhile, as although self-deprecating, I think it is particularly insightful. He went on to reflect. In the business of these societies, where I was a member of more than one successively, I cannot boast of having made a great figure. I was never a good speaker, unless upon some subject which strongly animated my feelings, as I was totally unaccustomed to a composition, as well as to the art of generalising my ideas upon any subject. My literary essays were but very poor work. I never attempted them unless I was compelled to do so by the regulations of the society, and then I was like the Lord of Castle Rackrent, who was obliged to cut down a tree to get a few faggots to boil the kettle. For the quality of ponderous and miscellaneous knowledge which I really possess on many subjects was not easily condensed or brought to bear upon the subject I wished particularly to become a master of. Yet there occurred opportunities when the odd lumber of my brain, especially that which was connected to the recondite parts of history, did me, as Hamlet says, yeoman service. My memory of events was like one of the large, old-fashioned stone cannons of the Turks, very difficult to load and discharge, but making a powerful effect when by good chance any object had come within its range of shot. Such fortunate opportunities of exploding with effect maintained my literary character amongst my companions, with whom I soon met with great indulgence and regard. I mentioned earlier in this talk that I would return to the relics, that is the venerated objects of the society associated or representing Scott, and which some of you will see when visiting halls on Saturday. Of course, Scott's name and hand turn up regularly in the various archives, especially the Minute Book. He is also well represented in the library, despite fiction not generally being in favour, an exception being made principally for the volumes works of Scott and Robert Louis Stevenson. In addition to his own works, there are numerous additional critical and biographical works. There are also numerous books about Scott, including multiple copies of his published journal, including a dedicated copy by Sir Eric Anderson. Also on the shelves is one of the key published resources for this lecture, Arthur Melville Clarke's Sir Walter Scott, The Formative Years, published in 1969. Melville Clarke was a notable English literature academic as well as a very active Spec member, who also had the distinction of being president of the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club and proposed our toast at the 50th annual dinner in 1958. I was curious and looked up his attendance at the North British Hotel that night. It was 244. We're not quite there this evening. We made a jolly good show of it. His talk that evening was on Scott and Shakespeare. Now, Melville Clarke is one of many joint Spec and Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club members, and hopefully this is a tradition we can maintain and perhaps even build on. Also on the library shelves is a copy of Lockhart's one-volume Life of Sir Walter Scott, which he himself donated in 1842. Lockhart followed his father and father-in-law into the Spec, joining when he came to Edinburgh to read law in 1815. His father, who had joined 30 years previously, doubtless encouraged his membership. In 1818, Lockhart met Scott, who introduced him to his family, he marrying his eldest daughter Sophia in April 1820. Whilst he became an advocate in 1816, it was his varied and distinguished literary career which earned him the distinction of having his engraved portrait placed in halls. For those of you attending on Saturday, you'll discover why it faces the wall. Opposite Lockhart's portrait is the principal one of Scott. Scott is the most represented figure in halls, the top three being Francis Jeffrey, John Wilson and Scott. The principal portrait in halls is that of Sir John Watson Gordon. This was commissioned following the death of Scott. This society resolved to memorialise him in halls. So Watson Gordon was commissioned to make a copy of his 1830 portrait. Following the death of Raeburn, Watson Gordon was the leading portraitist in Scotland and painted several portraits of Scott throughout his lifetime. The original 1830 version had been commissioned by the publisher Robert Carroll, so that it could be engraved as an illustration for his Magnus Opus edition. Scott was reluctant to sit for portraits, giving him a single sitting on this occasion. At this time he was 58 and in decline, and during poor health and the effects of financial ruin. Scott sits serenely, full face with his hands resting, one above the other on a walking stick. He wears a dark green coat and yellow waistcoat, with an unworn black hat and gloves lying by his side. The Eildon Hills can be seen to the left, and Scott's new staghound Bran is on the right in the original and on the left in the Spec edition. Until recently, much of the detail and colour was lost, but greatly improved following a recent restoration, although viewing by candlelight still obscures some of the details. Vying with his portrait as Scott's icon in halls is his death mask cast, which I referred to at the beginning of this talk. This normally hangs in the lobby, but it is placed on the secretary's desk on the admission of ordinary and honorary members. It is one of several copies and variations after the original mask. The death mask was made by George Bullock, who in 1814 had also made a life mask. It was made at the request of the leading phrenologist Dr. Johann Spurzheim. Scott's post-mortem had removed and analysed his brain, the results of which were afterwards published. Shortly afterwards, a cast was made of his head, the first doing little to hide the open gash across his cranium and clearly showing the effects of his earlier stroke on his features. Edinburgh phrenologist George Combe in the 1850s produced several variant copies, and these are the ones you have likely seen elsewhere. However, as Combe was frustrated that the skull had been damaged by the post-mortem, he removed the obvious scars from his version. Whilst the source and time of acquisition of the Spec version remain uncertain, the obvious scarring on our copy indicates that this was one of the earliest copies made. The death of Scott began a new phase of Scott being the most being the subject of innumerable celebrations, essays and debates. The main anniversaries, including the recent 250th, were especially marked. In bringing this lecture to an end, I'd like to mention one debate, not one of my own, which was on the superiority of Mr. Scott or Mr. Stevenson, but rather one involving Christopher Murray Grieve, more popularly known as his pen name Hugh McDermott. Having been granted honorary privileges and membership in the mid-1960s, having never been a member before, he was keen to attend the special night marking the bicentenary of Scott's birth. Having first dined at the University Staff Club on nearby Chambers Street, appropriately exactly opposite Scott's birthplace, over 40 members gathered to hear an essay on the Abbotsford Library and a debate on Would Scott like Scotland now? Mr. Rennie and Mr. Fairburn, the appointed openers, failed in their long preamble debate in their attempt to turn Scott's portrait to the wall, suggesting that enough drink had been taken, but not too much. However, the same might not have been said in the case of Grieve. Perhaps it was just unfamiliarity with halls and their immemorial customs and laws, for before the debate had even got substantially underway, he, and again against convention, arose burdened with books and notes to launch upon a, quote, heated but scholarly criticism of Scott, the English writer, a man who adopted for the wrong side, a man who intromitted wrongly, but whose mastery of Scotch dialect could have been employed to far greater effect for the benefit of Scottish literature. Scots literature. Grieve's impassioned contribution over the debate finally got underway, with 15 members speaking and eventually being voted upon, 10 negative, 8 affirmative, and 4 on either or neither side. So Scott would not have liked 1971 Scotland according to the spec, although I suspect he would have loved to be back in halls that one night. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for what I think it's fair to say has been a really fascinating glimpse into that sort of burgeoning world of the societies of Edinburgh in mid-18th century Edinburgh, and then how that might have played a part in inflecting some of Scott's fictions, but also I think how Scott really played a huge part in a diligent and dutiful part in those societies as well. So thank you ever so much, David. We do have a little bit of time for some questions now, so I'll open the floor for any questions. Right at the very back, Eric.
Mr. McClay, David, you give a wee speculative thought, really, for this esteemed speculative society. Might there be a crossover with Walter Scott Society if one might consider setting an essay, and there are 40 people here tonight. Could you put an essay and give us a wee competition for a senior citizenship membership of said speculative society? I thought, my mind boggles. Got 2.5 pages of notes, so you should all have something to say.
Thanks. We'll leave it at that. Any other questions or comments?
David, thank you very much. That was splendid. Really got one thinking about an awful lot, particularly about the sort of the cultural climate of Edinburgh at the time, and the spec as part of a larger kind of ecosystem of literary societies and learned societies. Say the RSE as well was really kind of rich at that period in forming these young minds, Scott in particular. But something I really loved that you brought tonight was the idea of Scott using his old homework for an essay spec, and then reusing that material later on. You gave the examples of the essays on romance and chivalry, which are both in the 1824. And actually, I think, from looking at history, I think a very early history of the spec, I get a sense that he might have used a lot of other people's material on European and Greek drama in his essay on the drama, also in 1824. But I wonder if this is just a guess, you're wondering if we had any sense of what he might have talked about when it came to Scandinavian mythology. I think his contributions to the illustrations of Northern antiquities might be a good place to look for that, judging by his kind of reuse, repeat, recycle.
Yeah.
That's just what came to mind.
Yeah. Any one section of this could have formed an entire lecture this evening, so I deliberately kept it very broad, and I think you could trace certainly his essays. I think what would make a more interesting in-depth analysis is the essays he heard. So what was he learning through that? Because it was one of the periods of lowest attendance, but absolutely brilliant people. And I'll not go through the whole list of them, but even someone with a passing familiarity with the late 18th century or early 19th century will recognise half of the names almost immediately as people of some distinction. But of course they didn't necessarily know that when they were all 19, 20. And it is a formative time. The kind of reusing of work, I think a more positive spin we could possibly put on it is it was an improving society. So there was a thing of, don't come thinking you know everything about a subject, that you're polished in any one of these skills or abilities, that you should be looking to refine and improve. I think this is possibly why some of the debate titles get reused so often. I mean, some of them 3-4 times in a period of 5 years. And it surely wasn't beyond them to come up with a broader range of subjects. I think actually most of the debate subjects, at least in rewording, could still be suitable debates in the spec today, and indeed some of them do reappear. I quite like that timeless quality. I find it hard to think about the spec in the past without thinking about the spec in the present, partly because there is so little variation. Scott quite happily could step back into halls on a regular night in the spec schedule, and I think just fit in very happily. He would know the format and the structure of the evening, he would know the range of personalities that you need to contest with, you would know the variable quality of contributions and so on, and how to respond to that. But I quite like the fact that knowing the spec today gives you some insight to kind of Scott's time. So hopefully I've captured a little bit of that this evening in the talk.
Yes. David, I was just wondering how Scott would have viewed the fact that women were finally allowed to join. What would his reaction have been? Entirely positive, I'm sure.
I'm not sure it would have been. I mean, certainly for Scott's time, women had their spaces, men had their spaces, there were communal spaces. I can't, perhaps others more informed can, if Scott spoke up about women's admission into education or anything else. I think he would have thought it an interesting experiment, but I don't think he would have campaigned for it. I have to say we have finally become enlightened in the more fuller sense, and female members are not only welcome but a vital part of the society today. So that's probably the biggest difference and the one change that we have made since Scott's time.
I just wanted to know whether or not the halls have been moved in the old college, because you said that it's in the southwest corner of the college.
So the original halls, let me get my bearings now. I've abandoned the compass points and just, so if you go through the main entrance, it used to be top left, effectively the far end of Playfair Library. Right, okay. It's more or less where the old building used to run. Indeed, some of the illustrations I was talking about by Robert Syme, which are in older Edinburgh, he produced this kind of large prints. You can see half of the curve in the old building still kind of just getting taken down. So that's where it was, and it's now in the opposite corner. So yeah, again, we'll give some instructions about how to get there at the end, but not just now.
Are there any final questions, any other questions in the room? And if not, I'm sure there'll be an opportunity to think of some more and to ask them a little bit later. But thank you so much, David, for answering those questions so generously there. And so I'd like to now invite David Todd to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, David. You brought back so many memories of the spec for me. I'm a fellow extraordinary member of the spec, and have been present at 2 Walter Scott anniversaries, I was president on the night of the 150th anniversary of his death in 1982, where the late great John Pinkerton gave an essay on Sir Walter Scott's sex life. We'd had such a good dinner before that I don't remember very much about it. I don't think it was particularly interesting. I mean, the talk was interesting, but not his sex life. And then I was present again just recently at the 250th anniversary of his birth in 2021. And what is wonderful about your description of Walter Scott, and which I wasn't aware of, is that all the tasks that he undertook meant that he was completely involved, and he was like that in the rest of his life. He was a great polymath, interested in so much. My background in theatre shows him at the Theatre Royal, turning a lot of his novels into stage plays. He rediscovered the honours of Scotland. He was involved in so much of Edinburgh's life, and that early time in the Spec, where he was secretary, librarian, and treasurer, all at once, is just typical of that. So thank you, David, for a really lovely exploration of Walter Scott's time in the Spec. And as you said, the great thing is that what you described happening in the 1790s is exactly what happens today. So thank you very much.
Everybody that the evening isn't over yet. If you're able to do so, you're very welcome to stay for some refreshments, which will be available just outside shortly. So I do want to invite us to thank our speaker one more time, with the caveat that I'm going to invite you to speak again, David. Not the entire lecture again, but just to speak briefly about Saturday. But before you do, if I can invite everyone to thank our speaker one more time.
Much trailed, much advertised, the trip on Saturday to see the halls. I found it difficult to work out what balance of images to show you in advance of halls, and I wanted to leave some as a surprise. I think seeing them in person, getting to see particularly some of the minute books, to see the debating hall lit by candle and so on, will be quite an experience. So most of you, I think, have probably signed up in advance. I do have a list of those names that are confirmed. There's not serious security issues, but there is logistical issues around making sure we don't leave anyone behind, we don't leave anyone stranded. So if you haven't signed up yet, could I ask you to add your name to this sheet this evening? It just means we can keep track of here. We've decided, because it's proven so popular, to add some additional tours. So the tour will take roughly, well, we're allowing an hour. So some of it will be formal, some will be time just to browse yourself. You don't need to stay for the full hour if you don't want to. But we're going to have the first one at 12:30, the second one at 1:30. You guessed it, the final one at 2:30. If you know which one you're likely to come along to, it would be helpful just for planning if you could just tick against your name which one you think you might come along to. Not essential, but helpful if you do have a sense. Now, most of you will know Old College, sort of in Southbridge. But what you might not know is where we're going to muster. Now, we've got an arrow and a red dot, so this is Southbridge behind. I'm not sure which gates will be open on a Saturday. Sometimes they close one or two of them. We've got the two small side gates and the large one, which used to be the car entrance when we still had the car park. One or two or three of these gates will be open. So whichever one you come through, you come up the slopes and the stairs. Can I ask people to kind of just muster in the corner of the lawn? There will inevitably be students and tourists and things around as well. So if you do recognise friends, good to cluster together, so I don't need to go up to different people. Are you a Scot person and get befuddled looks? So if you can maybe gather 5, possibly 10 minutes. It's cold, so don't turn up too early before the official tour starts. We'll gather together, we'll take you into halls, there'll be some refreshments to keep you going. We'll have a little talk about some of the things not mentioned during the talk this evening, a chance to see some of the objects and so on, and our thanks to the Speculative Society office bearers for allowing this tour I say, although it's exceptionally rare, as mentioned, that strangers are allowed in halls during sessions, we do occasionally open up the halls to visitors, and I can't think of a more appropriate group to have than the Walter Scott Club. So I'm so pleased that so many of you have signed up for it. Any immediate questions about that? No, great. Well, I look forward to seeing some, if not most of you, on Saturday for this. It may be me who comes out, or it may be one of the Speculative Society members who's helping on the day will come out, but will make themselves known, and we'll bring you in. Great. One final bit of business, and now I'm putting on my honorary secretary hat. Some of you will recall that I sent an email recently just with some general updates, and one of those is about Edinburgh University Press, and then discounting, remaindering effectively the last of the Waverley novel set. For those of you who have been in touch already, sorry that this has taken a while, I've renegotiated a better deal, is the reason why. So initially they were going to discount these books from kind of £80 to £111, that's the current price, down to £19.99 each. I said, that's not enough, we need to discount it more. They've got money to spend on attending talks. So it's now an 85% discount across the board. This means the cheapest volumes are £13.65, and the most expensive ones are £16 something, 50 I think. So that's a substantial discount on the original price. So if you are interested and you haven't yet been in touch with me, please do. I suspect some of the volumes with smaller stock might go quite quickly, so book early to avoid disappointment, as they say. I've also managed to negotiate for one person. I can't guarantee it for everyone, but I'll certainly try an even greater discount. If you want to buy all available copies, I think there was 16 available originally, but when they checked their stock there's only 14. You can buy the full set at £10 a volume, which I think is a remarkably good value. That's only if you buy the complete set. I say I can't guarantee that, but I strongly suspect that probably can make a good pitch to them. So do onsec at walterscottclub.com.
Secretary at walterscottclub.com.
Thank you. There we go. Yeah, I gave it wrong one last time. And I'll pick that up over the weekend. Okay.
Oh, just David, could you mention about the website to see if anybody's got any pointers of whether it's being redesigned?
Would you want to do? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Sorry to keep the canopies are at 8, so I've just got 30 seconds. The current website, I'm afraid, is being decommissioned. It's built on an old legacy platform. So the arduous task is now set before me to completely download everything and build it again onto a new platform. So if anybody would like to just look at the website over the next few months, my task is to build it in the new year again. So if there's anything you like about the website, just let me know. If anything, this could be redesigned. Now's a good time to have an evaluation of it, because unfortunately the whole thing has got to be rebuilt. So thanks.
Perfect timing. I believe that's 8 o'clock. Wine and canopies are about to be served. Thank you very much.